century as early concepts of Zionism are being developed in Europe. And this is a story of the long-suffering exile who would be redeemed through a restoration to an originary homeland. And though in the 19th century, we're already seeing elements of this development in practice, not just through the more legible history of sporadic Jewish migration to Palestine, but also in the thinking emerging around the colonization of Liberia from figures such as Edward Wilmot Blyden, who was committed to and inspired by the marvelousness of Zionism and played a key role in the development of the colonial Liberian state, as well as sitting as a key progenitor of Senghor-style Pan-Africanism. And this frame of thinking resolves the predicament of landlessness and the unsafety inherent in exclusion from political power by constructing a transhistorically stable cultural community displaced from an originary land, Palestine or Africa. As Blyden put it, he's everywhere a familiar object and he is everywhere out of Africa a servant of others. This politics thus fits freedom within the framework of the nation state, and the achievement of a strong independent nation state is seen as the only route to safety. There's an alternative route, which is the route of transformation, which embraced the material condition of landlessness as a standpoint from which to find the universal in the particular. Fanon drives this out of Sartre in borrowing his description of the Jews as missionaries of the universal against an incomplete or the incomplete universalisms and humanisms presented to us by modernity and capitalism. I think here of conversations with Barnaby about his commitment to hyphenating anti-Semitism, as I did in the title of the event. And I think of what he's doing here is identifying that while the Jew, as we understand it, is an invention of the anti-Semite, this corresponds to an emergence of a set of material conditions which create a particular articulation of Semitic culture, the rootless cosmopolitan, which should be celebrated and cultivated as a route to a universalist emancipatory project. I think in this sense then that the Jew and the Black are the two, perhaps I shouldn't foreclose the possibility of others, rootless cosmopolitans created by modernity's cultures of racialism. And this speaks to a 20th century anti-Semitism used by elites to make sense of social upheaval, which rationalized the cosmopolitanism of Jewish radicalism as machinations against European values, rather than the struggle to finish the unfulfilled promise of true universalism made by modernity. Today, that tends to be articulated through the dog whistles of cultural Marxism. The rootless cosmopolitan, the missionary of the universal, is an imminent possibility created by the terrors of modernity as experienced by Jews and Blacks, which can only become a viable politics when the suffering of others becomes legible to you, i.e. through principled struggle, which opposes the principle of oppression and exploitation, not simply that those things are being done to you. And Huey Newton describes this process beautifully when he describes his thinking around Black liberation. He says, the present fact is that we cannot ask our grandparents to teach us some native tongue, or dance, or point out our homeland on a map. Certainly we are not citizens of the United States. Our hopes for freedom then lie in the future, a future which may hold a positive elimination of national boundaries and ties, a future of the world where a human world society may be so structured as to benefit all the Earth's people, not peoples. And I've thought for a long time that there's a lot of treasure to be recovered in a careful, as in sensitive and rigorous examination of these parallels, and we'll be unpacking some of those today. This sits in a beautiful tradition from Fanon's careful comparison of the Negro and Sartre's Jew to Baldwin's reflections on what has been described as Black anti-Semitism and the positioning of Blacks and Jews within the moral arc of modernity, to Huey Newton's subtextual dialogue with Jewish universalisms and the themes of vanguardism and chosenness, and certainly through the work of Paul Gilroy in the Black Atlantic in uncovering and recentering the longer history of this dialogue between Jewish thought and Black thought. However, if this conversation is anything, it's a provocation for more thinking, writing, sharing around this framework. I certainly still have some unresolved questions, and I hope that after today, there may be more fellow travelers. There's a lot to cover, and we're going to be very strict with ourselves, but we want to have as much time as possible for questions and to generate a broader discussion. So we'll be discussing for just over an hour, at which point we'll be turning over to you guys for some questions. And we're happy to go on till 8, but if you aren't able to stay the whole time, we'll be uploading the full talk and including the questions this evening. So I'm just going to get started and say, Barnaby, You've written about moral panics as a helpful concept to make sense of what's going on today. So I just wanted you to talk a bit about that.
Wonderful. Firstly, thank you for your amazing introduction. It's a special joy to be on a conversation about anti-Semitism with someone who is such a careful thinker, which I have to say is rare on this topic. So it's really lovely to be here with you. I have to avoid the temptation to just make this whole thing a kind of love-in between me and okay, so you asked me about this concept, the moral panic. I'm going to start my timer now and be rigorous with myself. So I take this concept from one of its classic articulations, which is in this amazing book, Policing the Crisis, by a group of colleagues, Birmingham colleagues, cultural theorists, including Stuart Hall, where they are thinking about the question of muggings. And I think about anti-Semitism today the way it's talked about in quite similar ways. So they're interested not just in the fact of muggings, but in a massive media panic, right-wing media panic largely, about a spate of muggings. And they begin from a premise which says the increase in muggings that's happening in British society is not so enormous that it sort of easily justifies this amazing media concern. So it must be, in other words, that there is something that isn't just the mugging, which is going on when the media talk about muggings. It must be that they're using muggings as a way of panicking about something else. And the book is amazing for its series of transformations in the logics of both race and class in British society that it makes the kind of real precursor to this panic about muggings. Much more to say about that, of course, but for our purposes here, the interesting thing to me is that the authors treat moral panics as responding to really existing rising phenomena. So they don't claim there's no such thing as muggings. In fact, what they claim is that although the fact of increasing muggings isn't really what's being panicked about when people claim to be panicked about muggings, it's really they're panicking about other things, it might be that the same ultimate causes, the same massive transformations in the workings of race and class in British society might explain both the increase in muggings and also this panic, which claims to be about muggings, but is really about those transformations. And that model I take as very useful for thinking about anti-Semitism. So what is this moral panic about anti-Semitism today? There is, of course, a huge media and state and politician concern with anti-Semitism. People who tend not to have much issue with all sorts of other racisms are suddenly very concerned. People on the right and also on the center are suddenly very concerned now, they say, about Jews. So what is this moral panic if it's not simply about Jews? Well, I think there's an interesting kind of gendered doubling going on. So I think that the way that Jews are now imagined is as abroad, the kind of hardy, muscular settler who's expanding the frontiers of Europe. This is what Israel is, right? That's why, you know, Zionists traditionally haven't much like people like me. Anyone who's seen my arms knows I'm not very good at planting a farm. I've never made any deserts bloom. So abroad, the Jew is reimagined as just like the early American settlers heading west for Europe. This very macho image, very brave and bold, and at home as a kind of vulnerable population in need of protection from the savage hordes of the wretched of the earth. You know, that's Palestinians obviously in the Middle East, but it's also you know, Muslim immigrants who in France for about 20 years now be constructed as a central threat to the Jewish population. So that Jews function as a kind of alibi for white society, where when you're worried about the anger of the wretched of the earth, Jews become like your chosen vulnerable population that you have to, in this classically patriarchal way, depict yourself as power, as protecting that vulnerable population. Think about the way that white supremacy in America spoke about white women needing protection from violent black men, or the way that Section 28 in Britain talked about children needing protection from these dangerous spectre of gay men. That clearly wasn't really about white women or children. It was about using those, constructing those populations as vulnerable in order to defend your existing kinds of bigotries, your existing kind of society. So a really classic example of this is when a far-right Australian politician got in trouble for talking a couple of years ago, actually less than a couple of years ago, talking about final solutions. He said, "What are you doing attacking me, calling me an anti-Semite? I'm the person who protects Jews because I want to stop Muslim immigration to Australia, which is obviously a threat to Jews, and because I really support the state of Israel." So there you see that kind of doubling that I'm talking about. Jews as the kind of vulnerable white woman in the metropole in need of protection from the wretched of the earth, and abroad the heroic settler for Europe, so that Europe can really be comfortable with this population. Okay, if that's the moral panic, why does it emerge now? Why is there suddenly this huge concern with anti-Semitism in popular discourse? And bear in mind, as I think we're going to go on to talk about, well, one shouldn't go on to think that because there's this moral panic about anti-Semitism, that means there isn't real anti-Semitism, which is, I think we'll talk about. Why this moral panic now? Well, clearly a large part of the explanation, because there are different forces that come together in a kind of hegemonic bloc, unstably advocating this concern about anti-Semitism. Clearly for some of them, it's all about Israel, it's all about Palestine. But of course, the attempt to shut down anti-Zionists with allegations of anti-Semitism is a long-running attempt whose history many of us are familiar with. Why is there this huge increase now in concern about anti-Semitism? I think it isn't all about Israel. I think it's also about a kind of anxiety about the ending of neoliberal technocracy, the return of confrontational politics, that convenient ideological horseshoe which gets called populism in contemporary debates, the return of a kind of politics of confrontation after the 2008 financial crash. And so if you read, for example, the letter that the Board of Deputies and the Jewish Leadership Council wrote to Jeremy Corbyn complaining about his anti-Semitism, shit, I'm going to run over time, they talk about a far left worldview that is instinctively hostile to mainstream Jewish communities, in which mainstream Jewish communities are believed to be a hostile entity, a class enemy. It isn't all simply a concern about anti-Zionism, it's a concern about the return of class politics, where if you read anti-Semitism as unique because it punches up rather than punching down, then any kind of anti-elitist politics can be constructed as potentially anti-Semitic. That then, and so a recent tweet from the Reagan Battalion, right-wing group in America, goes, Jews are all rich, okay, and Jews control the banks, okay, and go out and get a job and become rich too, maybe even the CEO of a bank. Hating on Jews won't get you anywhere. So there's this kind of philo-Semitism in which you really believe the anti-Semitic claim that Jews are rich and powerful, and you love them for it, and therefore you read all politics of opposition to concentrated power as potentially anti-Semitic. Now there's much more that I had down to say about this, much more, but I will leave it there because I'm going to run us out of time. So my question to you, Annie, is whether we can think in similar kind of ways, whether that kind of language of moral panic can help us, because I haven't seen anyone do this, to think in an analogous way about the language around anti-Blackness that we see today.
So, okay, I'm going to start my timer. I think when I think about moral panic, and I was in preparation for this conversation, I was thinking about what you've written about it. I was also reminded again of a provocation that Muhammad made in the last session, where he talked about Blackness as always being a political project, and asking the question, what kind of political project is Blackness today? And I think we tend to think of moral panic at the level of broader society, in large part because we don't think of or acknowledge that subcultures also have their own subcultures of power. So once I get into that frame, and once I got into that frame, it began to make a lot more sense to me. I'm thinking now of anti-Blackness as a moral panic. I'm thinking firstly along three lines. So along the lines of political Blackness as being this phenomenon which is constantly revived by people who are opposed to it, right? And it's a cycle, right? A right-wing, non-Black POC says something. There's someone who quote tweets about political Blackness, and you expect me to be in solidarity with these people. And then anyone who kind of problematizes the essentialism of thinking that this view is representative of all non-Black people of color then gets mobbed. And anyone who also like problematizes the kind of anti-solidarity. I'm thinking also about the ways in which the prejudices of South Asians become in this worldview even more powerful in people's minds than the sort of state apparatus which is mobilized against working class people of all backgrounds. And then thirdly, thinking of the kind of patterns of mobbing and retributive exclusion which are called for in response to sort of defenses of political Blackness or charges of anti-Blackness, or kind of the positing of an alternative politics. And just thinking about that in relation to what you were talking about with regards to mugging, and when it's centered around crime, moral panic usually requires or demands of the state a more harsh sentence, imprisonment, and those kind of castle logics seem to have implanted themselves into the way that thinking operates in sort of the discussion or discourse around anti-Blackness. But what is it really in response to? I think firstly, there's a set of anxieties which are unresolved around non-white exploitation and the absence of a readily available language for us to discuss this. And that's happened through a process of us witnessing neoliberalism and the post-colonial compromise and the establishment of a firm and integrated Black and brown bourgeoisie, which upsets the previously sort of stable relational understanding of Blackness as a position of objection. I think there's also another set of anxieties which are being sort of displaced into this, which is diasporic anxieties about dislocation from culture. So there are two sort of examples which I think kind of draw this out. Firstly, there was a conversation I had years ago with an old comrade or friend or fellow traveller when I was involved in Rosemoss Fall in Oxford, where I was talking about one night over drinks the importance of decentering the transatlantic slave trade in a broader sort of schema of thinking about Blackness, because it's not the experience of the vast majority of the world's African descendant population. And this person wasn't even sort of a descendant of slavery. He was grew up in America, but wasn't a sort of slave descendant. But his response to me was simply, "You're denying me of my history." I'm thinking also of the kind of ambivalent experience of second and third generation immigrants who achieved some degree of indigeneity vis-a-vis new immigrants. So like waves of Eastern European migration, or even, you know, Caribbeans vis-a-vis African migration, which tends to happen later. Within a neoliberal context, which is demanding this sort of packaging of the self as a unique sellable product, which produces discourses, for example, around Black culture, which treats working class inner city culture, which is multiracial, as simply an expression of Black culture. And I think in both the case of Jews and Blacks, these kind of anxieties, in the way that it mobilizes itself and the further which it can get, is fed by a visceral but mimetic relationship with the histories of violence and terrorization, extermination, dehumanization, that are sort of embedded in the story of the Jew and the story of the Black. And that's to say, really importantly, that I don't doubt the sincerity of people who sort of fear and distrust and sort of mobilize this politics. But I'm thinking about how that real kind of panic gets whipped up and how it then gets subsumed and mobilized by the broader aims of moral panic in terms of sort of mystifying particular sets of relations. I'll leave it there. That's my 5.
Yeah, you see, I wasn't timing you, Annie. Yeah.
That was my 5.
No, you were as loyal as I was. There's so much that I want to say in response to that. One is that I'm happy that you agree with me that the concept is a useful one and that it works usefully in this analogous case. You know, it's very different, for example, from the concept of the witch hunt, which is frequently used on the left about campaigns against anti-Semitism from the right and the center, because in a witch hunt, of course, there aren't real witches. Now, that's complicated because we talk about McCarthyism as a witch hunt, there were real communists, but this distinctive, the way that the concept of the moral panic is used is really to highlight this idea that there's both a real phenomenon and a panic about it. The panic about it isn't reducible to the real phenomenon, but they might have the same ultimate causes. I mean, for example, I think if you're puzzled by asking the question, why is it that when Wiley tweets some anti-Semitic stuff, there's a big campaign to leave social media, but David Duke, the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, has been on social media for years tweeting out lots of anti-Semitic stuff, including sort of the same day that Wiley was sending out his stuff? Why is there this huge panic when it's a Black man who does it and not when David Duke does it? And there are really bad ways of answering that question. You know, like for example, it must just be that the Jews control social media and hate Black people. I mean, that becomes an answer to the question. Whereas if instead you think there's a social formation that isn't run by Jews, but has a use for this moral panic, I think it gets you to much better answers. I just wanted to very quickly talk about 3 analogies that struck me when you were talking. The first one that is really important for us to grapple with, I think, is that you've done lots of critical work on Afro-pessimism. And Zionism, I think, is really remarkably similar to Afro-pessimism in that these are 2 ways of thinking which say the whole of society is ontologically organized to exclude a particular population, Jews or Black people. And therefore, any kind of cosmopolitan politics that wants to transform society is ruled out. Zionism then has a clear answer amid a kind of optimistic utopian 19th century settler colonial moment. Let's just leave and set up our own separate society. Of course, there were answers like that in Black politics as well at the time. Afro-pessimism in a much more pessimistic moment doesn't have that answer. It doesn't claim to have any kind of answer. But they both rely on really eternalizing and essentializing the view that the whole of human history is predicated on excluding these particular populations, but no way out. And I think that's an important analogy we need to think more about. The second analogy is the huge focus on celebrating exploiting this category lived experience, which I'm sure we'll say more about because it's such an important thing today, where, it's striking, you can't speak over someone's lived experience, which causes real problems in a debate where, of course, a Jewish person brought up in the contemporary British Jewish community might really believe that me flying a Palestinian flag is an anti-Semitic gesture. They might experience it that way. And it's remarkable how we've lost the confidence of the kind of most basic tradition of critical theory, which says you have to start by asking how experience is produced by ideological lenses. There are just so, it's kind of pre-Freudian the way we talk about experience now, as if it's just transparent and innocent. And so I think there's lots of that going on in both the anti-Semitism debate and the anti-Blackness debate. And then the last thing, very quickly, is this idea of this bad binary, where basically people feel forced to choose between going along with bad ways of talking about bigotry or denying that there's much bigotry at all, because those are the only ways that have been established. So in practice, you either have to say, yes, I'm worried about anti-Semitism, so let's accept a definition of it that would criminalize solidarity with Palestine, the so-called IHRA definition. Or if you don't want to do that, you say, well, maybe anti-Semitism doesn't really exist very much, or it's been exaggerated, or it only exists on the far right, which we know how to talk about. So that kind of sense of a bad binary between defensive-ness or denialism, going along with the moral panic or denying the problem at all, I think is something we're both trying to get beyond by recovering better traditions. I've spoken too much again.
No, it's okay. I think, so two things sort of pop out at me. I'll try and make them quick. The first is that when you one of the really difficult things about the way in which the sort of moral panic around anti-Semitism has been conducted in the past 5 years, or 5 years, is that it acts to confirm a set of biases, and you hinted at this in what you were just saying now. So if we're operating at the level of the world as I experience it is the world, if you are a young sort of Black or brown kid who's constantly experiencing racism, experiencing violation by the state, the police force, etc., and constantly you're being barraged with these stories of around anti-Semitism in the media, and you don't hear any kind of discussion, or worse still at times, in response to the Wiley stuff, there were people like David Baddiel saying, if this was Black people he was talking about, if it were a white person talking about Black people, then, this would have been sorted out a long time ago, which is just factually incorrect, right? Mm-hmm. So the way you might experience that, absent a language, which I think we're going to talk about a bit later, a language which can sort of put that into context for you in terms of how the world actually operates, and a language which describes the processes which you're experiencing, it's possible that one might experience that or understand that as Jewish power, as opposed to an articulation of a broader set of, or a convergence of the interests of elites with talking about anti-Semitism. Because in a lot of cases, I do think, while I think the sort of sense of fear or panic is real, in a lot of cases, I think there are some sort of cynical, players in this who mobilize that fear when they actually don't care about anti-Semitism. And I think that tends to be borne out in the ways in which, that tends to be borne out in the sort of double standards which are applied. I don't know if you agree with that.
No,
but I think,
absolutely.
I think also that it's important then to sort of talk about what actually is going on with anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of your sort of thinking around this has been a really good route in for me to sort of think through some questions I have about what's been termed Black anti-Semitism. So I thought if you could give a few words on what you think about it.
Yeah, so if I said that this moral panic, I think, is responding a kind of convergence of interests around people who are particularly keen on defending the state of Israel, with also people who care much more about class politics and who read a resurgent class politics after the decades of neoliberal hegemony, and want to cast it as something dodgy, where anti-Semitism is the kind of dodgy face of anti-elitism. I said before that the reason this concept moral panics interests me is partly because it posits the possibility that there are common causes for both a real phenomenon and also a panic about it. And in this case, I think of 3 dates as being really important to help us think about the real resurgence of anti-Semitism that we're seeing. One is 1989, where we were told that history had ended and a politics of social transformation was unthinkable, was impossible. The second is 9/11, where we rediscovered with gusto that politics was possible as long as its antagonisms were cultural rather than social. You know, burghers facing off against burkas at its crudest. That's what the war on terror was. That's what the clash of civilizations is. You can have your fundamental politics of antagonism as long as the antagonisms are cultural. And then third, in 2008, the return of questions of what gets called the economy, right? And amid a crisis, an economic crisis, and unemployment and whatever. So if you take those 3 dates together, I think you have this particular scenario in which you've been told that a fundamental politics of social transformation is impossible. The antagonisms that really matter in your world are cultural, and you want a language for talking about the economy. And in that setting, George Soros is the kind of ideal villain. You know, the Jewish billionaire whose problem is that he's a Jewish billionaire. You're not seeking anymore to end capitalist society. What you're seeking instead is this much more conservative politics. Why anti-Semitism is a brand of right-wing politics, not a brand of left-wing politics, which seeks not to transform the whole structure of social relations, but merely to identify a particular cancerous ethnic group or religious group that you can easily zap in order to defend the whole structure of your social relations, which can remain intact. The problem isn't the existence of capitalism. The problem is the existence of this particular financial outgrowth, which is really the problem of these rootless cosmopolitans, Jews. Now, all that might sound quite traditional in ways of thinking about Jews, but I think there are lots of things there that are quite new. For example, I think that where traditional anti-Semitism had that reassuring dynamic of saying, you just need to zap this cancer and then we'll all be fine, I think that much of what you find online today is this use of a kind of end of history, capitalist realism, deep pessimism about politics, where to talk about the Jews is not to say there's a cancer that we can easily zap and keep our society and its basic social structure intact, but is rather to say there's no point doing politics because this nebulous they will always stop you, will always get in the way. I think that's a lot of the structure, the pessimistic structure of contemporary anti-Semitic thinking. The other thing that I think is really important in thinking about it in these terms is that you realize that anti-Semitism is not simply important for being about Jews. It's important because, because one of the responses to me talking about this is to say, well, Jews in Britain are kind of okay today. And I think we are. And I think there's some, I think we're sort of broadly okay in Britain today. But you realize that much of the damage of anti-Semitic thinking is that it sets up broader ways of thinking about politics. And once you see this kind of meme, this way of thinking about politics in which you identify small conspiracies that are responsible for doing damage to your otherwise healthy body politic. Even better if those conspiracies can be sort of ethnically constituted as an other to you, and you just need to zap them and your body politics is healthy. Then I think you would stop talking about Russian conspiracies behind Donald Trump's election and behind the Brexit vote as responsible for everything. You would see, in other words, that this is a much more general way of talking about politics. And part of the kind of really grisly irony is that many of those people who claim to be warriors against anti-Semitism, which they imagine in this misplaced moral panic way as just a problem of like black people, Palestinians and the left, actually often iterate the same kinds of thinking that define anti-Semitism when they talked about the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain as being this evil group of Trotskyist entryists who'd seized control of the Labour Party, or when they talk about Brexit being caused by Russian conspiracies, or when they talk about union barons who are some cynical conspiracy holding the country to ransom. Boris Johnson, in one of his mayoral campaigns, produced an advert that had Ken Livingstone sat with all these cigar-smoking union barons who were controlling London. Not that different from the kind of imagery of traditional anti-Semitism. Then the last thing I'll say about this is just that I think that this also suggests if it's a broader problem of a kind of ideology that appears at a certain moment of historical development, then it's not simply a problem of some nefarious evil individuals. And so the whole way of talking about anti-Semitism as some evil people who have to be expelled from parties or disciplined or sent aggressive letters, that clearly becomes a very impoverished way to think about racism if it's a much general ideological problem. I'll leave it there, more to say again, but my question to Annie is just how this ties in with your thinking about anti-Semitism.
So I think it was kind of a breakthrough moment for me, actually, because I've been developing this sort of analogy of the sort of notion of privilege as pathogen and the way that that fits into the kind of essentialisms that we see in contemporary politics. And actually, maybe I'm one of the few people who actually thinks there are distinctive articulations of anti-Semitism among some Black people, which aren't simply the restating of elite European anxieties and stereotypes. But I don't think it's any more prevalent in the form that we saw with, say, Wiley. But I do think it's worth kind of unpacking that as a route into thinking about the way, the ways a route into the ways of thinking about the world that we get offered today. So I'm thinking firstly of cultural nationalism and Afro-pessimism, which exaggerates the significance of particular ethnic groups, particularly Jews in the slave trade, of Jewish lawyers and execs in hip hop and sport. And I think this kind of centers around a cultural nationalist reclamation of the pharaoh as Black from white Europe, which produces a tension between this nationalism's kind of particular conception of Black power, which is rooted in an Afrocentric history, which valorizes the sort of pharaoh, the Mansa Musa figure, and its conception of Black ethical legitimacy, which it views as being stemming from, you know, social death as a process, the sort of slave experience, which excludes Black people from modernity's kind of viewed immorality, which is also a kind of Americocentric historicity around Blackness. And I think at this juncture, where these two kind of meet, both the slave and the pharaoh are Black in a sense. And then we kind of displace that into a set of anxieties around Jews, about sort of the role of Jews in the oppression of Blacks as this sort of long-suffering people. But I think it also kind of manifests itself in a broader, which I'll talk about in a second, sort of cultural sort of aggression towards other groups. And then I think secondly, of these really interesting smaller sects, like the Black Hebrew Israelites, who were responsible, or two sort of people who had been connected to them were responsible for the Jersey shooting at a kosher supermarket, a shooting in Jersey City at a kosher supermarket, or like hoteps as they're popularly called. And we saw a video recently of one lambasting a strictly Orthodox Jewish family on a tube. And I'm thinking about this sort of contrast, which comes from another side of contrasting the reclamation of the pharaoh with the reclamation of the Jewish slave as Black, and this imaginary which kind of situates Black people as the originator of all, and this form of racialization in which Jews then not particularly, and I think this is kind of not really talked about and wasn't really discussed around the kind of Wiley situation, a particular form of anti-Semitism which is levied against Ashkenazi Jews. And I think there is a really interesting conversation to be had around the extent to which contemporary forms of anti-Semitism do center on Ashkenazi Jews, but they then become usurpers through this process of Aryanizing Jewishness. And so Black people are the original slave, and that form of, they kind of lose their capacity for redemption because of this usurpation. And I think that produces a great hostility, and you'll see that on like street corners, etc., where these sects will, you know, congregate on Saturdays. I've seen it in Harlem, I've seen it in London, and just shout at people about essentially anti-Semitic conspiracies. And I think what's really important here is thinking through Fagon's concept of lived experience, and that's the kind of route I have into thinking about lived experience, versus the contemporary usage, which treats the unanalyzed world, or the world as we encounter it as a unique kind of site of epistemic value, and sort of valorization of the world as I experience it, being on my lived experience in that sense, and being the sort of main site from which we should draw knowledge and thinking around the world. And I'm thinking in that sense of Baldwin's formulation. He wrote an article in '67 on Black anti-Semitism, where he talks about how actually what's happening is a process in which, you know, as a young Black kid in Harlem, you experience the aggression of your landlord, who happens to be Jewish, the aggression of your grocer, who happens to be Jewish, the sort of difficult tension with a pawnbroker who happens to be Jewish. But in this, what's salient is that you view their Jewishness as more important than them being also capitalists who are driven by a set of market imperatives. And I think that's kind of also missing from the way that we talk about or understand sort of subaltern forms of anti-Semitism. Oh my gosh, I've got so much more to say. But I think also what's important there is that, the way in which the left have come to understand anti-Semitism, where it accepts that it is a problem, is to displace it onto other classes of people, is to say it couldn't possibly be a sort of working class phenomenon, or couldn't possibly be something that gets traction amongst the working class. And I've seen, you know, recently discussions around it being a sort of petty bourgeois phenomenon. And I think one thing that is really difficult that we have to sort of tackle and grasp or engage with is that these sort of subaltern populations are beginning to use this sort of mode of thinking as a way of understanding the world. Yeah, I'll hand over to you, but I've got a bit more to say.
Annie, I think you have more to say, so we can just cut out my reply time that we've
Okay. So I think taking that a step further, one of the ways that I've also begun to think about this is as Jews being a kind of prototype in the broader arc of Black nationalist thinking and its contemporary kind of iterations of a kind of figure which can be substituted for any ethnic group which you encounter as the face of capital. So I was reading Baldwin's article, and what struck me is that the way that he describes the experience of Harlem is very similar to the way that people in the inner city, so like people in Newham would describe their experience of Newham in relation to South Asians, right? And I think one thing that's really interesting that kind of got missed is, and I was talking to a friend about the Wiley situation, he grew up in Bow, which is a working class Jewish area. And I think that kind of model of thinking from Baldwin can be quite illuminating in sort of understanding this broader sense in which people encounter capital at a particular level and register it as cultural difference as opposed to a set of class relations. And I think that also sort of brings us into a broader understanding of this pattern of thinking as a kind of individuating treatment of people as the embodiment of the structures themselves. So I was thinking about it as a prototype for non-Black POC. I don't think we've had this conversation, but I'm thinking it can even go further in terms of the ways that we understand privilege and the ways that we understand, for example, whiteness today, right? So contemporarily, we kind of sort of au fait in leftist circles to think of whiteness is this thing which is inescapable for white people. And there are a set of privileges which correspond directly to being white. And I increasingly thinking about it as, a sort of form of cultural clash in which people view their encounters. So in organizing, for example, you will be organizing in a coalition. A white person will say something stupid or something racist, or a man will say something misogynistic, and it's like, aha, that was always inside of you because that was always your interest. Your interest was always counterposed to mine. And I think we've kind of lost the traditions of sort of leftist organizing and thinking, which can allow us to treat the coalition form as rooted in a set of shared material interests, which aren't, I think a better way of sort of putting that is that then means that race is doing the work of abstraction. So it's creating a different community into which you can identify, into which you share your interests, which obscure class relations. And it creates other communities which you can identify yourself as in opposition to, which also obscure your class relations. And so the behaviors of people who are operating under capitalist sort of imperatives then become read through the lens of race or culture or ethnicity rather than through the lens of class relations. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I just want to underline for people who missed it, because I think it's quite useful. This thinking that you've been doing around the idea that the Jew functions as a kind of prototype for how South Asians are now sometimes constructed in supposedly anti-racist discourse, where the claim is there is a particular, so we hear a lot about South Asian anti-blackness, as you mentioned, so that there is an idea that there's a particular community which is claiming to be a victim, but really is actually victimizing us because we must be at the bottom of the train.
Yeah.
At the bottom of the chain, sorry. And so the idea of that, of anti-Semitism as a kind of prototype for contemporary Afro-pessimists and other sort of anti-blackness discourse, I think is quite powerful. I actually want to say something very quickly about that and then ask you a question that leads on. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Which is, I think that the crucially important thing about what you've just been saying is seeing that you can't talk about anything that you want to call racism without talking about the invention of race as itself the basic problem. It's kind of like a sort of negative version of how Feuerbach, the German materialist tradition, thinks about religion, where you project all of your positive qualities onto this external being God, and then this God is this amazing thing. So, it's a kind of negative version of that, where you project all that you dislike about yourself and about others, whatever, onto this purely devil-like image, which is this other race that you imagine as a problem. And so that the problem is not the fact that Wiley realizes that there are power differentials in the hip hop business. The problem is that he sees those through the frame race. And like the response which wants to either accept the racism or just deny the facts is never gonna get you anywhere. You know, there's an amazing example I found in 1931, I think it is, Antonio Gramsci writes this letter to his sister who is sort of spreading anti-Semitic stereotypes. And Gramsci's mocking her and saying, the problem is the idea that you think there is this coherent thing called a Jewish race which can do anything and can have any qualities. And then he says, actually Zionists think the same thing. That tradition is core to much of the anti-racist tradition that we've slightly lost, perhaps. You know, when Sartre writes his Anti-Semite and Jew, he begins from the idea that the anti-Semites you mentioned creates the Jew. That's then central to how Fanon thinks about the image of the boy who says, look, mama, a Negro, you know, in black skin, white.
I was also going to say
invention of race, which is the work that you need to undermine. I want to ask you a question, but sorry, go on.
Just quickly, in response to that quote, that discussion of Gramsci, I was going to say in Fanon, in The Fact of Blackness, he talks about sort of challenging a friend's anti-Semitism, and he says, I tried in vain to get him to concede that such a statement was the fruit of a determined desire to find the essence of the Jew. So that kind of frame of thinking means that we're constantly seeking a confirmation of the already set biases, right? So we already have an understanding of how the world works, and we're just going through the world seeking confirmation of that. So we already have an understanding of these groups as having oppositional interest to ours. So any kind of solidarity is itself already an aberration, or sort of a departure from sort of the norm. And when they do end up, which at times people will, messing up, that then becomes, you know, that was in you all along, that was sort of central to your essence.
Exactly. And so, okay, last comment. And so, in this moment of supposed huge concern about anti-Semitism, how many people are going back and reading Fanon, who in Black Skin, White Masks and elsewhere actually is a really interesting reader of anti-Semitism? You mentioned how influenced he was by Sartre's work on anti-Semitism. But because he has this sense of the work of constructing a thing called race is the problem. And so he says what he calls negrophobia is the displacement of all sorts of anxieties about sexual virility, for example, and physical strength onto this idea of this terrifying, powerful black man. And then he says, okay, so what is anti-Semitism doing? Well, it's a displacement of a different set of anxieties. You construct the Jew not as the sexually virile, physically powerful thing. You know, I wouldn't fit with that. But instead, you construct the Jew as the intellectually cunning. And so you displace all your anxieties about your own intellect or your own financial position onto this image, this racial image. And it's seeing that work of inventing race as the problem where Fanon is in such a good tradition, so forgotten. So my question to you is, discussions like this on the left can sometimes risk a kind of romantic nostalgia for past solidarities. And I think we're going to talk at the end about some of those solidarities, which we do want to have a sense of. But how should we think about the question of how we got to this place? How we got to this place of moral panic where ways of talking about both anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness, so-called, seem so unmoored from what we would regard as sort of useful ways of talking about these real phenomena. How did we get here?
I think a starting point is to say that when I mentioned in the introduction, there was a sort of crossroad in a post-war moment, that the alternative tradition versus what has kind of become the hegemonic was also available. So post-war, there was, you know, Zionism, but there was also Bundist traditions. Post-war, there was cultural nationalism, but there was also the Black Panther Project, right? And I think there is a question to be raised about why in this particular moment we've seen the resurgence or the generalization of racial realism. And I think that's partly because of it being a kind of under-theorized element of the neoliberal turn, which is produced in part by the ahistoricity of contemporary thinking. Actually, Paul Gilroy just did in conversation for the Sarah Parker Remond Center, which covers this topic really beautifully. But I think this comes in a few steps. I think firstly, we've got the reintroduction of a highly unstable, but really incredibly potent reconstitution of racial groups, which are produced by modernity, but are dislocated from the particular processes which produce them. And I think that has been manifest in a set of or like dislocation of political theory within the academy from sort of history, and the sort of lost traditions of thinking through political questions using history. I think the second is that we've seen an inversion of what we used to think of as history being written by the victors, with a kind of fetishization of the notion of particular histories being the property of those who are the legible victims of it. And I think that means that we've gotten to a position where we rendered the fact of comparison or analogy an affront to the group's integrity or recognition. So I'm thinking of the ways in which the very comparison of forms of anti-Semitism experienced by Jews, or the very comparison to forms or the transatlantic slave trade or the violence experienced by Black people is treated as itself a form of anti-Semitism, or as itself a form of anti-Blackness. And then thirdly, we've seen a kind of reorientation from histories, in particular intellectual and political histories of struggle, which expose the kind of multiple and competing currents of thought to histories of kind of mimetic terror and victimhood. And I'm thinking of how the kind of 1970s engagement with history by Black political movements and Black scholars who were emerging out of it treated Black history through a history of Black resistance, and the kind of intellectual histories of those resistance, and also the political histories of those resistance, which drew out the kind of themes which sort of show us at each particular moment these groups are responding to a particular set of conditions, right? And instead of that, we've got this kind of canon, which I've talked about before, of Black history, which kind of stretches from the sort of pre-colonial Africa, which is essentially treated as a meme in like a lot of scholarship within the social sciences around Africa, then through to the kind of untold but the untold terror of the transatlantic slave trade, which is never really unpacked in any meaningful sense. It's kind of a set of mythologies that we have about the transatlantic slave trade. They came to Africa, you know, snatched people away because they were Black, and never kind of any engagement, for example, with the roles of like slave traders on the coast, etc. And then we kind of get Black power, which works to obscure a particular, you know, moment in which you have a huge outpouring of Black intellectual output and Black political output, but there are currents within it which are diametrically opposed. And so today you could, for example, speak of yourself as like an Afro-pessimist, which kind of has its roots in Black nationalist discourses, whilst also thinking of yourself as somebody who is a student of the Panthers, or thinking of yourself as someone who is a student of Fanon, right? And so I think that those kind of processes have led us to a position in which we have a really, I think, messed up relationship intellectually with history and also politically. I think also we've got another question which we want to answer in the neoliberal moment, which is, why has X group done better or started to do better than us? And that tends to be, why has, for example, why have South Asians started to do better than Black people? Or why have Jews started to do better than Black people? And I think the three answers which one could give, or three answers which have been given. So from the state, and for sections of the Black bourgeoisie, etc., we get the kind of bootstraps, model minority, reasoning. These groups integrated into society, they took on the challenge and the promise of the American dream, and then as a consequence of that, they've been rewarded with material advances. The second is the kind of sort of subaltern standpoint, which kind of treats it as a result of a particular betrayal. And I talked about this last time, where you kind of see them either as having made a pact with the devil, so the kind of notion of having been sold out by South Asians in a political blackness formation in Britain, or what is increasingly becoming the case, viewing them as the devil all along. And I think that fits really well with kind of particular analyses around particular anti-Semitic analyses around the relation between Blacks and Jews. But I think the third is a far more difficult one, which is, I don't really have a full answer to this. I hope you can sort of think more with me on this. But like, if you are thinking through this from a sort of Marxist standpoint, if you are thinking through this from a position which understands that though we are seeing a set of sort of cultural changes in the way that people identify themselves and experience the world, these are corresponding to a set of material changes. The question is then, how do we marry an analysis which is intuitive of an analysis which treats the level of intuition, so what people experience of the world, with the kind of social processes and the material processes which produce those shifts. I don't know if that makes sense, but go ahead.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, I think that part of the problem we have to grapple with is how you deal with a changing material world that renders the past construction of your solidarities no longer immediately materially feasible. So equal anti-racism requires it to be the case that Jews and blacks are similarly proletarianized, which may work in parts of the East End of London in the 1930s. Then as the class structure changes, you might face real problems. And part of the difficulty that you've been highlighting is the work of individuating the way that you think about class structure, so that you blame the changes in the class structure on people who look to you like its beneficiaries, rather than thinking that there's an impersonal structure and people are slotted into different positions. They're bearers, as we know Marx says, of their positions, but they're not sort of responsible for authoring their positions. So, you know, in the essay that you mentioned, the James Baldwin essay, he talks about a kind of disappointment that he says might be at the root of a black anti-Semitism, a disappointment in Jews behaving like other white people. So there's a special hostility to the idea of the Jewish landlord, more than just any other kind of white landlord, because you're disappointed that someone who has this past history of persecution and suffering could become just like another white person at some moment. And of course, we see a lot of that in discourses around Palestine. You know, how could Jews with their history be oppressing Palestinians? And, you know, there's that old, I've forgotten who it was, who said Auschwitz was not a university. And Baldwin makes the same point. I mean, suffering isn't some ennobling thing from which you always learn and become marvelous and amazing. That disappointment actually is like, as Baldwin says, if you're really disappointed, you should just be disappointed with the human condition. We're not to be ennobled by suffering. So, you know, so I think that we have to be attentive in how we think about politics, and you, Annie, speak and think about this a lot, to the material conditions of possibility that make certain kinds of politics possible. And there's an analogy here between Jews in Britain and certain sections of the Indian population in Britain, where there's a kind of parallel with a population historically obviously targeted by all kinds of racism and violence, which then in the post-colonial moment gets told that its safety is reliant on the construction of a post-colonial state. And so now you have a situation where you get Hindu campaigns against the Labour Party for supporting Kashmiri freedom on the basis that this is an anti-Hindu thing that's targeting the Hindu, as it's increasingly constructed, state of India. And so you get this alliance developing between Labour Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of India. And so in both cases, you have communities who have chosen what you so kind of evocatively described at the beginning, who've chosen a route of assimilation and integration because it seemed to offer safety over a route of revolutionary transformation of the whole social order. And the trick and the important thing is not to respond to that choice in moralistic tones by saying, how dare you, but rather to understand that everyone's a victim of a social order predicated on racial violence, and so to be a bit more understanding of the kinds of choices that people make. Two quick last comments about this. One is to be aware that that act of recoding a once loathed group as suddenly accepted by power always kind of comes with its exceptions. I was having a discussion recently with a good mutual friend of ours, who actually I know is listening now, and I said that I'd thought that there's a kind of parallel between the way that Jews are constructed by power in Britain and the way that the gay community is constructed. You know, once they were the subject of state harassment and persecution, now they're held up as a kind of celebrated minority threatened by Muslims, for example. And she said, well, think about the way that the trans politics is still talked about. Like, there's still a kind of part of that LGBT community which is seen to represent a kind of a fundamental threat to the gendered order of the world in the way that gay men were once constructed as 30 years ago. Similarly, think about the way that Hasidim, strictly Orthodox Jews, are still the subject of state harassment. The prevent agenda still goes into their schools just like it goes into Muslim schools, and ask them if they're really sticking to British values, if they're accepting enough of gay kids. You know, they don't go into schools in Tory Hertfordshire and ask the white parents that. So in other words, that work of recoding is often not complete. And we should be attentive to those exceptions. And the last thing I wanted to say is that there's a dangerous, interesting kind of phenomenon of claims about double standards that you've already mentioned, Annie, which becomes really important in this moment where people feel that a past coalition is being torn apart and different racisms are being pitted off against each other and treated differently. It is so common to have Jews say, oh my God, if only this bigotry were being targeted against black and brown people, everyone would be up in arms about it, but no one cares when it's Jews. Anti-Semitism is acceptable. That's what, as you said, David Baddiel said, the comedian said the other day. And it is also so common to see, I think, for black people to say, all these politicians are falling over themselves to declare their opposition to anti-Semitism, while at the same time they're locking us up and deporting us. And so in both cases, you get this claim of a double standard, which functions to blame the other group, rather than to ask how a particular society needs to deploy different racisms in different ways. Again, much more to say about that, but I hope there are interesting things there. The basic thing is, if you think of yourself as someone who's interested in the material world, then it's so important to ask, how can we do radical politics in a way that is attentive to our real material conditions today, rather than rooting them in a past, even a revolutionary, wonderful past that is no longer with us, facing, as I think Breck put it, the bad new times, not just the good old ones. And your ability to do that in terms of anti-racist work is predicated not on needing people to have the same kind of experience as you in order to have a solidarity with them, but rather understanding how their very different experiences to yours are both constructed by the work of racialization, which often needs you to be different rather than the same. And that should be the basis of solidarity, rather than needing for it to be the case that if I, as a Black person, am working class, a Jewish person down the road is also working class.
I think, sorry, just to, I don't know, so I've been sort of testing this, but I think something I mentioned earlier around the sort of changing sort of nature of Blackness, which meant a hollowing out of the material relation which constituted Blackness as it was understood in the mid-20th century, which left behind essentially cultural nationalism. I think there's a sense in which we can talk about the coalitions between sort of racialized groups as having the sort of material being broken apart, or the process of them being broken apart being undergirded by a set of material processes. But I think there's also that same process which is happening internally to those groups as well. And so those groups no longer serve a purpose of sort of highlighting or demystifying particular processes of capitalism and imperialism, but instead work to obscure them. And I think one of the things that kind of gets missed often, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about moral panic, is that the kind of charges which get levied against South Asians could equally be levied against the sort of Black pound, Black capitalist, Beyonce kind of. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in the last couple of days around Beyonce's sort of release of her set of music videos, I haven't watched them all, so don't ask me for a kind of cultural critique, but is that the only language available to people to talk about that is the way in which she steals and repackages the image of Africa or an imagined Africa for the benefit of herself materially, right? As opposed to her position in a world in which she operates as somebody who, for example, owns or has collaborated on clothing lines where the profit margins are dependent on the use of sweatshop labor in South Asia, right? And just thinking about the ways in which even that form of culturalist thinking obscures our capacity to think about certain groups, not just as exploiting internally, but also exploiting other groups of people, and what that says about the constitution of or the sort of operations of power globally at the moment. Does that make sense?
It does. I am thinking that with time, we should move on to the last thing that I want to talk about, because we're predictably running way behind time.
Yeah.
I think very, very hypocritically, having just talked about the need to do our own thinking for ourselves and not simply rely on the past, we wanted to give a slightly joyous flavor of some of the better traditions of the past. I mean, I don't know, did you want to ask something about that? Or?
No, I mean, I've long been inspired both by, backstory. When I was writing my thesis on the Panthers, it was conversations with you about Jewish theology, which really helped me get to grips with Huey Newton's conception of chosenness and of vanguardism. And so I think in Jewish history and in Jewish theology, there are beautiful sort of traditions of this form of universalism. And I thought it would be great if you could speak to some of those.
I would love to. I think about this, I suppose, in sort of three steps. First, there is this tradition of Jewish universalism, most classically summed up by a couple of lines from Rosa Luxemburg, of course, the great revolutionary, who wrote, "What do I want with these special Jewish pains? I feel as close to the wretched victims of the rubber plantations in Putumayo and the blacks of Africa with whose bodies the Europeans play ball. I have no special corner in my heart for the ghetto. I am at home in the entire world." And that kind of tradition of Jewish universalism is sometimes how we see constructed the history, that you chose as the picture, I think quite movingly, for this event, which was a picture of the Rivonia trialists, people imprisoned, life imprisonment, for seeking to bring down the apartheid state through armed struggle in South Africa. The most famous Rivonia trialist, of course, was Nelson Mandela, but one of them, Dennis Goldberg, was a Jewish communist. So we can imagine the participation of Jews in leading roles in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Dennis Goldberg, Joe Slovo, Ruth First, Ronnie Caswells, people who made enormous sacrifices through this kind of universalism, which says, I'm rejecting my particular allegiance. It's not just about Jews, it's about a universal project, which ought to mean now, for example, is what calls so many of us to a politics of solidarity with Palestine and the Palestinian liberation struggle. But it's not really just a rejection of the particular. So the second, so if the first move is to say, okay, this is just like Jewish universalism, the second thing is this very classic essay by Isaac Deutscher, The Message of the Non-Jewish Jew, where he talks about the particular experiences of Jews as a basis for that universalism. It's the experience of being on the margins of societies, victims of subjugation and racism and persecution, that leads Jews to some in the kind of progressive strand, a Jewish radical tradition, by far never the only tradition in Jewish politics, but that leads some to generalize from their own experiences of suffering and persecution, a solidarity with all among the oppressed. So to say it isn't a contradiction that I hate anti-Semitism and loathe the state of Israel, it is because I hate anti-Semitism. I hate it not because I'm a Jew and I don't want to be targeted as a Jew. I hate it because it does this work of constructing people as ethnic ciphers rather than human beings, and then standing up for some people and not for others on the basis of their ethnicity. Therefore, I cannot have any truck with any of the politics of the state of Israel, and must support instead the Palestinian resistance. So there's a particular basis for your universalism. Your particular experience generates the politics of your universalism. That's a kind of hyper-materialist argument that I think is quite familiar to many on the left. But the thing that I am often struck by, and that I've sort of privately discussed with you, Annie, and lots of people, but it's sort of harder to write about, is that I don't think that it's just a basis of a material experience of persecution. I do also think that there are some themes in Jewish intellectual traditions and in Jewish theology that makes, for example, Karl Marx a very Jewish thinker. That Karl Marx is particularly interested in the connection between the particular and the universal. So he's not just a simple universalist like liberals who say there is a human being and we need human rights for everyone and you can be a universalist in the here and now. Marx needs a particular group in the here and now, the proletariat, which is going to realize universal emancipation. And that's very much how, unlike, say, Christianity and Islam, which are more simple forms of universalism, I think, that's how Judaism constructs its idea of chosenness. Big debate about what chosenness means. Obviously, to lots of anti-Semites, it's a claim about Jewish supremacy, Jewish superiority. But there are lots of traditions for thinking about chosenness not as a set of extra privileges, but a set of extra obligations, a vocation in the world. As you said, a kind of vanguard. Where, you know, Gentiles have to obey only 7 commandments, but Jews have to obey 613. It's not actually much fun being Jewish. Now, I'm not interested in using actual real Jews as an example of a vanguard in the world. I don't want to just go down to a synagogue and expect that I'm going to recruit there for my socialist organization. But I think that model for thinking about the particular as a root in what you in your introduction called, what was it, the messengers of the universal, or carrying the missionaries of the universal, exactly, carrying that possibility, I think is a theological tradition that's quite interesting. So, you know, when Sammy Davis Jr. converted to Judaism, he spoke about Christianity preaching love and Judaism preaching justice. Think about that great line from Exodus, justice, justice shall you pursue, as a kind of key command given to Jews. The idea of realizing in the world tikkun olam, justice becomes very important. And then the other thing about that Jewish tradition is that it really does take very seriously the kind of position of precarity, marginality, marginalization. My favorite prophets, people like Elijah, Isaiah, Amos, are speaking against the mainstream of their Jewish community at the time. I mean, the Haftorah reading that we say on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year, when everyone's in synagogue, and everyone who's ever going to be in synagogue is there for Yom Kippur, and the Day of Atonement, and the thing that we read together in synagogue is a prophetic condemnation of people who are fasting on this day when we're fasting, because their fast is meaningless, because they haven't also liberated the oppressed, given food to the hungry, opened the doors of the prisons. So we're reading an attack on contemporary Jews, written, you know, which we've included in the Bible. And so that idea, you know, and of course, when we celebrate the anti-apartheid Jews of South Africa, we ought to remember too that they were pariahs often within mainstream South African Jewish communities, which weren't so heavily involved in supporting the African National Congress and the armed struggle for liberation. So those Jewish traditions of the particular as the root to the universal, just a language of justice as the goal, not simply the universalization of love, as is the more Christian tradition, and also this idea of understanding being a missionary for justice as involving a kind of marginalization, even within your own community. I think that these are some interesting traditions that have fed into a politics of solidarity. I don't say they're the only thing, but that have fed into a politics of solidarity. And we need much more research and writing about them, to be honest. I'm interested in this stuff, but I'm not an expert. My academic work is not really about anti-Semitism or Jews at all. And outside that classic Isaac Deutscher essay that is, I think, so perhaps overquoted, The Message of the Non-Jewish Jew, or recent book Revolutionary Yiddishland, talking about a particular context in Eastern Europe. Our good close friend Sai Englet has a very smart critical review of that book in Salvage, the wonderful journal. We have very few full studies of anything called the Jewish radical tradition. Where I think we're perhaps at a slightly better point. I mean, you mentioned Paul Gilroy several times, for example, who we both admire so much. We're at a slightly better point in terms of work on the Black radical tradition. I would like there to be more research on this, and understanding that just like the Black radical tradition, this is one tradition pitted against many. So that there are throughout Jewish conservative and Jewish liberal traditions as well as that radical tradition. Okay, that's my spiel about Jewish stuff. How should we think about Black traditions of solidarity?
Okay, so I think I agree with you in terms of the importance of historical retrieval, both of the conditions and the politics, of both the conditions and politics. But that retrieval has to be clear about the historical, geographical, and material specificity precisely to answer this set of questions of what are the possibilities produced by particular sets of conditions, so that we can better think through what are the possibilities produced by the conditions that we're in. So, like I mentioned before, I think the Black Power meme obscures the kind of longer arc of the Black radical tradition and flattens it. So we can't see how militants are engaging with the particular conditions of their moment. So I guess the sort of three key examples always jump out at me. So firstly, the Panthers, and the Panthers' notion of the Black vanguard, which sees Black people, like in the Huey quote that I mentioned earlier, which sees Black people as poised to emancipate all humanity precisely because of the position that they're in. And you kind of saw that in the way that Huey conducted his relationships with other national liberation movements, for example, offering soldiers to Vietnam. Actually, the Panthers used to get married with rings which were fashioned from shot down, from US planes which had been shot down by the Vietnamese army. And I'm also thinking about the way in which Huey responds to a particular question he gets asked in a press conference around Jane Fonda, asking if he considers Jane Fonda to be a slave master. And he says, does she participate in the extraction of the surplus value of labor from the masses? That kind of tradition, which is sort of unwavering in its commitment to identifying and locating the actual dynamics of power, as opposed to the forms of mystification which would hide them from us. And then also thinking about the Rainbow Coalition, and there's a beautiful video online. I can't remember what it's called. I'm going to send it out to all the attendees afterwards and put it in the description. But it's Fred Hampton going to see the Young Lords, who are this organization who have a Confederate flag as their sort of main emblem, and trying to organize this group of people by finding the particular question.
Surely the Young Lords, aren't the Young Lords the Puerto Rican group?
Sorry, the Young Patriots.
Yeah. I don't know what they were called, but I know the story. Sorry.
But anyway, so they're trying to find the sort of particular set of things which allow Black politics to converge in the context of Chicago with this politics. And it emerges very quickly, these questions around housing, these questions around, police brutality, which are shared experiences. And so thinking out of oneself, I think I'm going to try and find this quote while I'm speaking from Fanon about the kind of condition of necessity, which is produced by my emancipation, which forces me out of myself, which forces me out of my particularity, because I realize that there's no way in which I can be emancipated purely on the basis of my own identity or my own experience. It has to be a generalized human emancipation in order for me to be truly free. I guess that's the sort of crux of it. The second kind of tradition I'm thinking about is Black consciousness and Biko, and thinking about his kind of version of South African, what has been termed political Blackness, even though all kind of Blackness is political, and the way in which Biko is kind of uncompromising in seeing state actions and kind of trying to break down that material solidarity. And I think this is a really good way of us thinking through kind of shifts and changes that have happened in the last 30 to 40 years, but being uncompromising in seeing, you know, state actions which offer appeasement to particular groups over other groups for what it is, which is an attempt to sort of break down solidarity, but also thinking it through in such a way that it opens up the possibility, not simply of it only being something that we can respond to in the context of conspiratorialism, or in the context of deliberate strategy by the state, but something which we can sort of generalize out, which is to think of the differential positions of racialized groups within the context of white supremacy, within the context of capitalism and imperialism, as being situated within that broader dynamic, and therefore that not foreclosing the possibility of solidarities, even if our experiences aren't exactly mirrored, because even if you have relative privileges in comparison to me, you may have those small privileges to lose, but you have all the world to gain through the process of revolution. And then I'm thinking also of Fanon and a kind of militant commitment to not simply racial emancipation, but the abolition of race altogether, race being the kind of social structure which stratifies and defines groups of people, racializes groups of people. And he has this quote where he talks about how his victory, he says, that victory played cat and mouse. It made a fool of me. As the other put it, when I was present, it was not. And when it was there, I was no longer. So this kind of project which takes this universal standpoint, or this universal, this particular standpoint of this particular position as a route into the abolition of that position altogether. And the kind of parallel with Marx and his thinking around the working class.
Tell us quickly, because other people don't know.
Well, the kind of like the class a class which abolishes itself, right? The working class abolishes the very category of wage labor in order to emancipate all, because it has a set of radical chains. I'm not really doing it justice. I don't speak so poetically about it. I don't speak as poetically about it as you do.
Not true, but anyway, go on.
But I guess I'll leave it there because we are sort of like at 7:15.
Yeah. I'm going to say one thing and then stop.
Mm-hmm.
Or do we not have time, and do I just go to? Should I not do that?
You can say your one thing and then we'll just go straight to questions. Sorry, Barbara.
Yeah, we're being appalling with timing. I just wanted to say something that Annie was just saying gave me this thought that we're so often asked to choose between thinking about changes that we dislike as the result of conspiracies. It must be that there's a devious hand that has planted these changes, or structures, changes in the regime, changes for Marxists, changes in the regime of accumulation, structural changes in the organization of capitalist accumulation, moved around different groups and put them in different positions, and it wasn't designed by any particular conspiratorial hand like the state. And of course, we have to be able to think about both things. Sometimes you gave the example of Steve Biko talking about the state's offer of the vote to Indians in South Africa, disorganizing a liberation movement where the ANC had made it so important that they they conceptualized Indians as part of the liberation struggle. Sometimes it's a devious ploy by states. And those states, those conspiring hands, are of course themselves the creations of structures, the products of structures. And sometimes it's an impersonal structural process without any devious hand behind that disorganization. We have to be much better at talking politically about the breaking down of our solidarities and the experience of our defeats as both things which are produced by nebulous agents that we dislike, and also things that are produced by still more nebulous structures that we have to be able to talk about, something like capital, which isn't just reducible to some billionaires or some capitalists. And so it's being able to think together about those things that I think is very important. Of course, so much more to say, but I know you can.
Okay, so we're going to go to questions now. So you are welcome to pop any questions that you do have into the chat box, the question Q&A box. Or we've got some already.
There are loads, and there are also loads that people have put. As they've sent, loads of people have been sending to just the two of us in the chat thing as well. So we have to look at those.
Okay.
I thought Jacob's is very interesting if you wanted to go with that, but I don't know what you...
Okay, so Jacob says, could you say something about anti-racism as either the history of a wound or history as a wound? One of the differences between histories of anti-Semitism and Black anti-racism has to do with how history is constituted as continuous or discontinuous. Afro-pessimism, for example, is broadly progressivist insofar as the racism of the now is treated as a culmination. Jewish anti-Semitism is often much more... Pardon?
Jewish anti-Semitism, I think you said, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Jewish anti-Semitism. I missed that in the earlier bit. Is often much more fixated on moments of the past which threaten to repeat. Should we be talking about making a history different from either progressive or repetitive myths, or simply leaving the past behind joyfully? How can the criticism of these two versions of mythic history be conjoined? Oh, wow.
Can I just say something about that? Because I think it's an amazing question. And I should start, as all the best answers start, by saying that I obviously do not have an answer. But Jacob's question just made me think about the importance of different ways of constructing history to different ways of thinking about different racisms. So that one thing that is, I think, often missed when people look at anti-Semitism and say, well, Jews are fine in Britain today, what's all the fuss about, is that the logic of anti-Semitism is not simply focused on the present, the awfulness of the present, in the way that, say, feminism might be concerned by patriarchal violence now, anti-racism might be concerned with racialized incarceration now, the new Jim Crow in America, whatever, you know. The distinctive structure of anti-Semitism is that it appears as a fear about moments of the past read as spectral, as possible harbingers of a bitter future. So we know that ever since the days of Pharaoh in Egypt, where Joseph was Pharaoh's prime minister, and then within generations, Jews are enslaved. In Weimar Germany, Jews are doing just fine, and then that is the precursor to the Holocaust. So the idea that sort of pride comes before a fall, and that we have these cycles in which the more Jews are doing fine and well, the more you're about to experience catastrophe. And that, of course, licenses paranoia, because there's no way of answering then, there's no way of arguing that you're meaningfully making progress against anti-Semitism, because the better things get, the worse they might be about to get, which is, of course, perfect for a paranoid thinking like I think most Zionists, in which there's just no answer. And that is, the problem is that it's both clearly paranoid and also clearly has a grain of truth to it. It is also clearly the case that because anti-Semitism often thinks of Jews as, in some sense, this kind of cancerous superior group that is an elite that has to be zapped, it is obviously true that moments of Jewish success can be the harbingers for anti-Semitism. So that particular way of thinking about the past, I think, is something that we really have to untangle. And as I say, I don't have answers in order to know how we avoid both paranoia on one hand and also dismissiveness on the other. Jacob's question just made me think about that. Especially his claim that anti-Semitism works by focusing on discontinuous events, dramatic single moments of catastrophe. I think that's why it does that. I think that's why it doesn't just think continuously about centuries of endless persecution and misery, but about events in which previous prosperity is suddenly disrupted. And yeah, I do think we have to be thinking about that. Annie?
Yeah, no, I don't have any answers, and I agree with everything you said, Bean. I'm going to be really cheeky and say that the question reminded me of a point that I'd made a few days ago to you about the sort of relationship between Black and Jewish struggles and temporality, which is to say that, that post-war crossroad that I set up at the beginning, at this crossroad, we'd already witnessed or experienced massive Jewish involvement in the sort of communist movements in Eastern Europe in the sort of early 20th century, right? And so the experience of the Holocaust is a disruption of what is kind of seen as, hopes of a kind of universal, a vision of universal emancipation, which then I think produces a level of despondency, which might explain the kind of route that we sort of saw the sort of most popular kind of iteration of that crossroad in the case of Jewish people take. Whereas I think the experience leading up to the war for Black people had not been, periods of mass resistance on the scale that we saw in the late 60s and early 70s. And so the post-war kind of predicament, actually prior to that, we'd seen, the sort of potency of Black nationalism or cultural nationalism or negritude. And then in the sort of post-war moment, we get the option of a Black Marxism, of a universal image, which I think produced the kind of route that Black people took at that moment, because, you know, obviously the Black Panthers in that period, in that sort of 67 to 73 period, are the largest Black organization in the States.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I wanted to add, and then I'm going to ask you, I've been finding good questions to ask you from the chat.
Okay.
You keep talking, hinting at that vision of what we talked about in this Marx class I was just teaching as Marxist tradition of imminent critique, where you premise your critique not in a set of moral claims about what you would like to be the case, but in claims about the possibilities of your present. And that also has very important relevance to how we think about the past, so that there is this danger always of constructing, in politics, of constructing an ideal past to which you want to return, which flattens the complexity of that past. You spoke about how that is a phenomenon of both Zionism, negating exile, negating the condition of being diasporic, and Afro-pessimism, which simply adds the kind of capitalist realist twist, the kind of Panglossian pessimism. We live in the best of all possible worlds and it's shit, which is, it's actually impossible to return to that past, so we can't do anything. I think about, in the Palestinian revolutionary tradition, Hassan Kanafani, the novelist, writes very evocatively about the idea of return, which is so central to Palestinian radical politics, as having to be sort of what he would think of as dialectical, where you're not simply returning to the pre-1948 world exactly as it was, where you romanticize what it was to have your olive grove, which is obviously hard not to romanticize when you're living in occupied territories, but that you have a sense of building a cosmopolitan future, which is not simply a return to that past. And I think also about James Baldwin's very astute criticism of Malcolm X when Malcolm's in his Nation of Islam phase. Obviously, Malcolm X came round, I think, for something much more like James Baldwin's position at the end of his life. But Baldwin says, I understand why you might want to say you're not an American. Of course, you've been excluded from what it is to be American. But actually, obviously, we built this country. I mean, we built the White House. So you are an American. And the thing you have to deal with is the fact that you're not, Malcolm, an African, Baldwin is saying. You are a particular kind of subject which is made by America and which is American. And that's the difficult thing that we have to grapple with. And, Jacob's question about how we think about the past just had me thinking about this importance of avoiding romanticizing past radical moments and instead asking what are the possibilities that are latent within the present. And that's a much more difficult question. And to do it can mean leaning on past traditions of thinking. I'm here saying I find Marx's method of imminent critique useful. You find much about the Black Panthers very useful. I find lots of Jewish radical traditions useful, anti-Zionist and Universalist traditions. But it doesn't mean thinking that their world is the same as ours. And that's a very important kind of challenge to...
oh God, I'm going to do...
Yeah, go
30 seconds. I remember way back when we were about to graduate and you were talking about, what Lenin is doing in Russia in the early 20th century, which is to take the tools of Marxism and apply it to a very different set of material conditions than what Marx was faced by, right? And I think that's in many ways what the innovation of the sort of Black Marxism in the 20th century is, which is to take the tools of Marxism, and consciously so and explicitly so, and apply it to the world as created by imperialism and capitalism. And that out of that comes Huey Newton's theory of intercommunalism, which posits that the greater integration which is created by the experience of imperialism means that we have the set of conditions for a cosmopolitan sort of vision of emancipation, because we don't have such strictly divided or separated out cultures as we had previously. There's so much more sort of intermixing and shared influences. But yeah, just thinking about that versus the way that we think about Marxism today, or the way that it's popular to think about Marxism today as the, capital is an analysis of the world or Marx gives an analysis of the world and of all history, and that just needs to be applied to these particular set of contexts. And I think that is what kind of separates our thinking out and the traditions that we're talking about from what would today be called a class reductionist.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so that's the perfect lead into this question for you, from Catherine. No, it is, in terms of, yeah, the battle against both class reductionism and race reductionism together. So I was disappointed to see recently how a Black early years consultant produced a guide for parents and educators for young children on anti-racist practice. And this guide on anti-racist practice was visibly sponsored by a large toy corporation, and the guide itself was linked to the company's website. She was not able to see how problematic that might be and spoke about her lived experience to counter that. So I wanted to ask you, in the BLM moment, I know you've had lots of thoughts about corporate reclamations of BLM and all those corporate statements. You've talked justicially, I know, about global clothing brands. How to think about this moment of a kind of corporate anti-racism, and what are good critical ways to think about that? Because we know the easy knee-jerk, just like it's easy to see the language of opposition to anti-Semitism being monopolized by the right, and so the easy knee-jerk is then to think that, you know, anti-Semitism mustn't be a particularly real problem at all. It's easy then for sections of the left, white left, to have this reaction of, oh my God, this whole anti-racist thing is just a kind of corporate conspiracy, we shouldn't talk about it. What are better ways to think critically about corporate organization?
I'm going to say one thing that people might not necessarily like, and I've kind of hinted at this quite a lot over the course of this talk, which is to say that the increasing interest of particular corporations in positing themselves as like forces for social justice can be situated within the context of the changing class or internal class dynamics of various different groups. So it's not just around questions of Blackness, it's also around questions of, you know, LGBT rights, etc. So I think there is one element in which the increasing buyer power marrying with sort of consumerism has sort of compelled corporations to begin to respond to sort of mass movements in this way. But I think the problem contemporarily is that we have kind of lost a sense of competing visions of the world. The recession of the left means that our sort of worldview is completely absent. And I'm thinking in response to that question of the critique of cultural nationalism, which is put forward by, I believe it's Linda Harrison, who's a Panther, and it's in it's in the Phonaberg, Black Panther Speaks. So it's just a collection of writings and speeches by the Panthers, where she says, you know, this cultural nationalism is very easy, and it very easily marries with capitalism precisely because it's a sellable product. And I think that kind of fits into, you know, that's kind of at the genesis of it, where, you know, you can talk about being Black and proud and Black is beautiful, and that means, you know, go out and buy your Afro comb, go out and buy your Sheen spray and all of that kind of stuff, right? But as that kind of melds with this process in neoliberalism of people beginning to view themselves and export themselves as products, the kind of Black community both becomes a product, both as Black culture, but also as Black consumers, right? And that leads me on to kind of thinking about the way in which narratives or Black capitalist narratives of Black emancipation are centered around notions of developing economic power, and economic power only being conceptualized as the capacity to exploit, to extract, you know, surplus value, therefore accumulate loads of wealth, and then the wealth of a few Black billionaires is viewed as collective wealth, right? So like Beyonce donating a few thousand dollars of her like $1 billion fortune is then somehow viewed as like a great symbol of like Black empowerment, versus a kind of historical view which kind of counterposes that vision of economic power with the economic power which is latent with our material condition in relation to capital, so the capacity of working classes, etc., or Black masses to disrupt processes of capital accumulation. Don't know if that answered the question, but those are the kind of thoughts it inspired.
Yeah, I was just thinking too about your point. You said to me the other day that it is revealing that when global clothing brands release statements of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, and these are clothing brands who rely on hyper-exploiting sweatshop labor. I know your friend Ashok Kumar has this very interesting book about this, Monopsony Capitalism.
Monopsony Capital, yeah.
And he's been sort of talking about this. What does it mean about your conception of blackness when you do not think that it's relevant to Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
There are people who, we remember the Rana Plaza tragedy, people whose lives are literally precarious, at stake, who could die, who exploitation is the condition of possibility for the profits that now claim. It's telling about what you think about blackness, how you narrowed it, that you're not included, and you can say while exploiting them.
Yeah, and it's telling that it therefore means that you have a vision of emancipation as your emancipation pitted in opposition to the emancipation of others. So I'm thinking about, I believe it was either Nike or Adidas release a sort of statement online saying, they're committing to a certain percentage of BAME employees. And if you think about the way in which the demand on organizations who responded to the Black Lives Matter moment with a commitment to increasing the numbers of POC or BAME employees, it's demanded of them that they tell us the number or the proportion of that group who will be Black, or commit to a particular proportion of that group who will be Black. And so it ends up being, scrambling for or competing for scraps in the context of a much broader system in which, the corporation always ends up as the winner. But I think that kind of narrowing, and I spoke about it a bit earlier when I was talking about responses to Beyonce's visual album, the narrowing of our worldview in which we can only conceptualize forms of exploitation or forms of violence as legible to us when it's experienced by our collective group. And that's articulated all the time. I remember back when there was the hoo-ha within the Black students campaign in the NUS, where they wanted to pass a motion around Palestine, and a particular social media influencer, will I say, who self-styled activist, responded to that by saying, Palestine will be free before me. This kind of their emancipation is their property. They work towards it. That's their interest. My interest is only in the emancipation of my group. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'm looking through the chat. I will quickly answer one question. Someone says, isn't that history of Jewish universalism that Barnaby mentioned the one that Israel is so keen to erase? And that is exactly right. There's a remarkable interview that Isaac Deutscher, who I mentioned, does with David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. And this is the moment immediately after the Holocaust when Deutscher is kind of edging, I think, a little too far away from his previous anti-Zionism. But he's still struck in that moment by the fact that David Ben-Gurion uses the language of rootless cosmopolitans to denigrate Jews outside Israel. So much of the history of modern Zionism is enmeshed in internalizing anti-Semitic views of Jews and just saying that there's hope. We can, by leaving Europe, really become proper Europeans, become farmers and soldiers, and not these cosmopolitans that Europeans hate us for being. So Ben-Gurion tellingly then uses that language of the rootless cosmopolitan to attack the universalist Jew. And Deutscher says, but isn't this the same language that Stalin is using in the anti-Semitic campaigns in the Soviet Union right now? And Ben-Gurion, of course, is embarrassed by that parallel and sort of shirks away from it. But Deutscher notes that the whole society, he says, and it's so relevant to our discussion, is obsessed with questions of roots. He says, it's about the idea that we've returned to our roots, we're rooted in this one place. And of course, there is something very limited about that. The questioner, I should say, goes on to quote that Theresa May line, the citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. That idea that you need roots or you're unmoored is a way of really dramatically narrowing the bounds of your politics, because it says to you, okay, you are Jewish, this is your homeland, this is what you care about. Which is very different from the missionaries of the universal kind of politics that you talked about, where I have my particular experiences, I have my particular intellectual traditions too, it's not just material experiences, and I use them to think about much broader experiences of oppression. So yeah, I think that the project of Zionism is so deeply opposed to the project of Jewish universalism, just as this is the parallel that got Annie and I talking for this event. I think we both think that implicitly the project of some contemporary Black politics of Afro-pessimism is so opposed, actually sometimes it's explicit, is opposed to universalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, so I guess there are two sort of questions which kind of mesh together in a sense, which is one on word usage, which says, hi, thanks for this conversation. I'd like your thoughts on word usage. I got here from thinking about and being annoyed about the ways in which Blackness is talked about in the media. Invariably, the question that springs to my mind when I when I read them is, which Blackness are we talking about here? That of my ancestry, Southern Angolan, African-American, Afro-British. What strategies can you suggest we use to avoid giving the idea of Blackness becoming something concrete, even when we're hopefully trying to do away with race altogether? And the second question kind of echoes that in terms of the question of, you know, how particular kind of thinking around Blackness reproduces British or American discourses around Blackness. I guess the thing to say here is twofold. I think, firstly, you know, I come to this as a second generation Nigerian who grew up in Britain and experienced this kind of ambivalent until very recently relationship with my heritage, but very much for most of my childhood thought of myself as British, but was constantly racialized or conceptualized as African. And actually, when I went to, we talked about this in the last time, when I went to school, it was like, you know, this contrast between like Caribbean Blackness versus African Blackness, in which African Blackness was always the sort of denigrated sort of side. I think what that sort of instilled in me is this same commitment that I've talked about through this to a set of, or an interrogation of particular conditions. So I hope, you know, it comes across that when I talk about particular sort of conditions of Blackness, I am locating them geographically, specifically, and also temporally in the moments which produce them. I think one thing to also be mindful of, and I've, you know, I don't know if, no, the piece hasn't actually come out, but I wrote about this recently, is that there is a conception of Blackness as cultural heritage, which I'm not necessarily, I mean, when I think of my cultural heritage, either I'm thinking of myself as Nigerian, but actually more specifically, I'm thinking of myself as Yoruba descendant, having grown up in a Yoruba household with those sort of cultural practices and that cultural history. And I think one of the things that is often an affront to me in the way that Blackness is portrayed is the way that it picks and chooses from different sort of Black cultures to sort of mesh into this, you know, sort of one super culture, which doesn't really reflect any of the people or the material reality on the ground on the continent. But I think where I'm coming from is as dealing with or wrestling with what seems to me to have been a clear articulation of Blackness in the 20th century, which could encapsulate all of these different cultural differences, which is the articulation of Blackness as a relation to capital, Blackness as a form of proletarianization, which is produced by the forcing of various different cultural ethnic groups and subsuming them under the category of worker, where previously they've been subsumed in the form of the transatlantic slave trade under the category of slave. And, you know, Baldwin has a really great quote when he came to speak in London, where he talks about how, you know, the history of America would have been very different if the slaves got off the ship and looked to the left and looked to the right and saw people who saw the same language, spoke the same language as them. But I think that the reason I'm wrestling with this is because I don't necessarily think that that relation is so clear in contemporary politics, and that's something that I'm certainly interested in and trying to explore in terms of the way that I historicize the processes of how we come to identify as Black, and then how we then understand that in the context of today. Does that make sense? I lost you, Bean.
No, you haven't lost me at all. I was thinking. I was thinking about whether we should give sort of closing thoughts about how we come this up, or if there's anything else you want to say before we do that.
No, not at the moment. I think, yeah, it would be good to get closing thoughts. We are getting to 1:45.
Yeah. So I hope that it's been clear these issues are complicated and can become insanely complicated, but I hope that it's been clear that Annie and I are engaged in a project of trying to persuade you that being a critical thinking person and believing in the possibility of universal human freedom means taking very seriously the forms of prejudice, bigotry, also structural racism that characterize our moment, without thinking that being skeptical of those things, loathing those things, should force you into a particular way of talking about those things, which is the way that now appears as dominant in our moment. And that instead you should ask how both the prejudice and the ways of talking about it might be produced by some sort of similar dynamics that we want to oppose. So you can think seriously about raising prejudice against Jews without assuming that in order to do that, you have to go along with an overwhelmingly right-wing or liberal and overwhelmingly Zionist way of talking about prejudice against Jews, in which the answer, it's assumed, is Jewish safety in a state of Israel, and the problem, it's assumed, comes above all from the wretched of the earth, from the Subaltern, from Black people, from Palestinians, from Muslims. There are different ways of talking about and thinking about the problem, which are also critical of the way in which that moral panic wants you to think about anti-Semitism. Likewise, I think, Annie's been arguing for quite a while, that there are ways of thinking about white supremacy today, ways of thinking about racism today, that are also critical of the way that the same moment has produced new kinds of racism and has produced ways of talking about that racism, which recede from previous grand optimistic horizons of social transformation and instead seek only the much more defensive aspiration to have a safe space which is policed, and to have particular communities which are defended and supported, and to have our lived experience validated. And while all of those things might be extremely important antidotes to a left in the past which was insufficiently attentive sometimes to those things, the idea that those things are constructed as the goal in itself, that you're not really optimistic about overhauling the whole of society but want a safe space within it, that you're not really optimistic about universal transformation but want to ensure that a particular group to which you belong is safe. Those kinds of politics might well arise out of the same problems that also generated resurgent racism today, which is a kind of a neoliberal condition. And I think what we've both tried to do is to argue that we should recover some past languages for thinking about racism, and also that in recovering them, we should recover above all, as Lukács famously said about Marx, their methods, and not think that recovering them simply means assuming that all of their conclusions are still valid in dramatically changed worlds. We should ask what those things still have to teach us and where we have to do a new thinking for ourselves. So what we're trying to escape here is a devil's choice, which says, either you hate bigotry and therefore you go along with the dominant discourse for talking about it, either you hate anti-Semitism and therefore you want to shut down critics of the state of Israel, or you're scared of shutting down critics of the state of Israel, so you just don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. Or either you're worried about police shooting unarmed Black men in America, so you have to take on a whole architecture of an infrastructure, I should say, of thinking, which comes from privilege theory and from intersectionality and from even Afro-pessimism, or you hate those things or you're skeptical of those things, so you've got to be a bit blasé about, statues and critical of people taking down racist statues and sort of scorn them, as some people on the white left in America have done. And we're trying to argue for an anti-racism that doesn't assume that it has to choose between following all of the contemporary assumptions of anti-racists or just not caring much about racism at all. We're trying instead to forge a better kind of anti-racism fitted to our changed conditions and not merely repeating the certainties of the past. I hope that has been clear in all of the complexity and the mishmash of the various things we've talked about. That's how I wanted to finish, and I should obviously hand over to Annie, who's been responsible for all of this, to finish properly. And I should thank Annie for inviting me to be here on this amazing series, so thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Bean, for coming on with me. And I echo everything that you just said. I think the problem with the position we find ourselves in, as in the last session we had a discussion about the lonely Black Marxist, is that the languages and traditions in which we're kind of enmeshed aren't absent from contemporary discourses, but they appear in a different form, arguing the opposite of how we interpret them, right? And so I think with such a project as, I think the reason we had so much to say is because with such a project, it involves first untangling the different associations that people have with, you know, concepts of Marxism, concepts of Black radical tradition, concepts of Zionism, before we can sort of do the work of beginning to piece together. And I think that is both a frightening and an exciting thing, which is to say that we're faced both with the mammoth task of recovering traditions from the past and methods of thinking about the world from the past, which in many cases are lost, but in other cases have to be completely reconfigured or reconstituted from the fragments that we have today. But it's an exciting task because I think it's the first step in beginning to think about the world that we have today, which can allow us to escape a politics of, as you said, you know, retreat, a politics which says that there's no point in politics. Simply what we have to do is kind of find enclaves in the world where we can be safe, which, as we know, is impossible, or to wait for the end of the world. And I think those things can produce a kind of profound despondence, which I think has articulated itself in the kind of theoretical posture of work that we're seeing contemporarily. Or work that we're seeing at the moment. So I think definitely I'm sort of pleased, it feels like getting a baby out into the world. I've already had one, so I kind of can do the comparison. But, you know, having thought about this and like worked through this with you for 5 years, and I'm just hoping that after this conversation, more people will be thinking through and working around this kind of comparative in order to generate better ways of thinking about the world. But I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and for staying with us for so long. I also wanted to thank Barbara for being an amazing moderator in the background. You know, when you see my face on the screen or Barnaby's face on the screen, that's Barbara working in the background. So I just want to thank Barbara for
thank you, Barbara,
using this. Thank you, Barbara.
Welcome.
And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. I will be trying to get the video up tonight, if possible. If that's not possible, it'll be up tomorrow. But yeah, no, I think it's best to just leave that there and say thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. And this is the start of a conversation. It will continue, right? For us and for many others. But thank you to so many. I can't believe how many people tuned in. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Solidarity, comrades. That's how we should end.